The knock came on a quiet Sunday morning, sharp enough to cut through the stillness of Emily Carter's small house in Oregon, and for reasons she could not explain, her heart reacted before her mind did, beating faster as she walked toward the door, already sensing that this visit would not be as ordinary as she had told herself it would be, because when she opened the door and saw Lucas standing there, her nephew, older, broader, carrying adulthood in his eyes, time seemed to fold in on itself, bringing back years she had carefully packed away, and Lucas smiled politely, the kind of smile people wear when they are nervous but trying not to show it, stepping inside with a travel bag and a quiet "Hi, Aunt Emily," as if he were unsure how much space he was allowed to take now, and Emily welcomed him with warmth that felt practiced but sincere, noticing how his voice had deepened, how his shoulders no longer slouched like the boy who once stayed with her during summers, how his presence filled the house in a way she had grown unaccustomed to after years of living alone, and as she helped him settle in, offering coffee, asking about the flight from Toronto, pointing out small changes she had made to the house, she became aware of a strange tension beneath their polite conversation, something unspoken that hovered between them, because Lucas answered her questions clearly but briefly, never drifting into stories, never laughing too long, his eyes often wandering to the walls where old photographs hung, as if he were searching for something familiar yet distant, and Emily felt the old ache return, the one she carried quietly through her days, the ache of choices made long ago, of love that had been paused and never restarted, of a life that looked complete from the outside but felt unfinished inside, and she wondered if Lucas could sense it too, this quiet emptiness that filled the rooms despite their neatness, and as they sat down at the small dining table to share a simple lunch, Emily realized she was studying him more than she should, noticing details she had missed before, the seriousness in his eyes, the way he held his cup as if grounding himself, the careful pauses before he spoke, and she remembered the last time she had seen him, a teenager full of restless energy, asking endless questions about the world, about love, about why people leave and why some stay, and she felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with something heavier, something closer to regret. Because she had always been the safe adult, the one who listened, the one who never explained too much about her own life, and now Lucas was no longer a child asking innocent questions, he was a man carrying his own history, and the realization unsettled her, because she sensed that his visit was not just about reconnecting, not just about family courtesy, but about answers, and as the afternoon light shifted and shadows grew longer, Emily tried to keep the mood light, suggesting a walk, talking about the neighborhood, but Lucas declined gently, saying he was tired, and when she watched him retreat to the guest room, closing the door with careful respect, she stood alone in the hallway, struck by a sudden awareness that something had already changed the moment he arrived, that the balance of her quiet life had been disturbed, and she felt both afraid and strangely alive, because the presence of another person who knew her past, even partially, stirred emotions she had learned to manage but never fully resolved. And as evening came and they sat again, this time in the living room with soft music playing in the background, Emily noticed Lucas glance at an old photo on the shelf, his eyes lingering longer than before, and though he said nothing, the look he gave it carried curiosity mixed with sadness, and Emily's throat tightened, because she knew that photograph represented a chapter she had never explained, a chapter she had closed quietly without ceremony, and she realized then that the visit had already crossed a line from casual to meaningful, that the ordinary beginning was only a cover for something deeper, something waiting patiently beneath the surface, and as Lucas finally wished her good night and the house settled into silence again, Emily lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, fully aware that the next days would not simply pass, that questions would rise, memories would speak, and truths long buried would not stay hidden much longer. Because some visits come not to rest, but to awaken what we thought was already over. The second day began with a quiet tension that neither Emily nor Lucas named, yet it followed them through the house like a shadow, because from the moment they shared a simple breakfast, there was a new carefulness in the way they spoke, as if both sensed that ordinary words were no longer enough, and Lucas seemed more observant now, watching Emily as she moved through her routines, noticing how she paused before answering certain questions, how her smile faded too quickly, how she chose her words like someone used to guarding old wounds, and as the morning passed, Emily suggested they sort through the storage room together, a harmless task she hoped would fill the hours, but the room itself carried memories stacked in dusty boxes, each one holding pieces of a life lived quietly, and Lucas opened them with curiosity, finding old books, letters, and photo albums that Emily had not touched in years. And though she tried to stay relaxed, her chest tightened with every item uncovered. Because these were not just objects, they were evidence of who she had been before she learned how to live alone, and Lucas sensed this too, slowing his movements, treating each discovery with care, until he found a small album tucked behind a box, its cover worn soft with time, and when he opened it, he saw pictures of Emily from a younger life, smiling freely beside people he did not recognize, her eyes brighter, her posture lighter. And something in those images struck him deeply, because they showed a version of his aunt he had never known, a woman shaped by love and hope rather than quiet endurance, and he looked up at her, asking gently who the man in one photo was, and Emily hesitated just long enough for the truth to show, before answering with a vague phrase about someone from long ago, someone who mattered once, and Lucas nodded, accepting the answer but not fully satisfied, because he could feel there was more beneath it, and as the day moved forward, they left the storage room behind and stepped outside, walking through the neighborhood under gray skies, their footsteps matching without effort, and Lucas spoke about his life in Canada, about work that paid the bills but left him restless, about relationships that never quite lasted, about a feeling that something in his life had always been missing, and Emily listened closely, recognizing the words, because she had lived that same feeling for years, and when Lucas admitted that after his mother's death, he had started questioning his family history, wondering about choices that shaped him before he had a voice, Emily felt a quiet fear rise in her, because she knew those questions pointed toward truths she had buried, and she realized that this visit was no accident, that Lucas had come carrying a need he could no longer ignore, and as they returned home, the silence between them was heavier but more honest, filled with things waiting to be said, and that evening, while Emily prepared dinner, Lucas wandered into the living room, his attention drawn again to the bookshelf, where framed photos stood like witnesses, and he picked one up slowly, studying it with care, noticing details others might miss, and Emily watched from the doorway, her heart pounding, because she knew that photograph marked the start of a story she had never told, and when Lucas asked why she had never married, his question came without judgment, only curiosity, but it landed with weight, because Emily had rehearsed many answers over the years, yet none felt right in that moment, and she responded honestly but carefully, saying, "Life did not always move the way people expect, that sometimes love arrives at the wrong time," and Lucas listened, his expression thoughtful, as if piecing together fragments of a puzzle, and later, as they sat with their dinner cooling between them, he shared that he had found letters among his mother's things, letters written in Emily's handwriting, filled with emotion and restraint, letters that spoke of distance, sacrifice, and deep affection, and at that admission, Emily felt the ground shift beneath her, because the past she had contained so carefully was now stepping into the present, and though Lucas did not press her for answers, the meaning was clear, that he knew there was a story linking them more deeply than he had ever been told, and as night fell, Emily excused herself early, retreating to her room, where she sat on the edge of the bed, holding memories she could no longer deny, remembering nights of hope, choices made out of fear, and the long silence that followed. While in the guest room, Lucas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling closer to the truth yet still distant from it, aware that something important waited just ahead, something that would explain not only Emily's quiet sadness but his own lifelong sense of incompleteness, and as the house settled into stillness, both understood that the walls around them were no longer just shelter, but witnesses to a past pressing forward, ready to be acknowledged, because some silences grow heavier with time, and when they finally demand attention, they do so without mercy. The next morning arrived with a strange sense of urgency, as if the house itself knew that ordinary conversation would no longer be enough, and Lucas, after a quiet breakfast, finally broke the careful silence that had stretched between them since his arrival, sitting at the kitchen table with hands folded, eyes serious, and saying softly but firmly that he hadn't come only for a casual visit, that he needed to understand the story behind the letters he had found, letters written in Emily's hand years ago, full of emotion, longing, and choices that had shaped both their lives, and Emily felt a sudden surge of fear and anticipation because she knew that day had come, the day she could no longer hide what had been buried in her heart for decades, and as Lucas explained how he had discovered the letters among his mother's things after her passing, Reading words that spoke of love lost, sacrifices made, and decisions that changed everything, Emily listened in stunned silence, feeling the weight of the past pressing into the present, every memory sharp, every emotion raw, because those letters were not just pieces of paper, they were fragments of a life she had lived secretly, full of hope and heartbreak, full of a love she had never fully claimed, and Lucas, though calm in tone, revealed the confusion and longing that had followed him through his life, the questions about his origins, about why certain doors had been closed, about choices made long before he could understand them, and as he looked at Emily, there was no accusation, no bitterness, only a deep desire to connect the dots of his own life, to finally understand where he came from, and Emily, feeling the tears welling in her eyes, realized that she could no longer protect herself with half-truths or quiet avoidance, that the moment demanded honesty, and so she began to speak, starting with the earliest memories, the love she had once held, the relationship she had cherished yet had to leave behind, the circumstances that forced her to step away, and the fear that had guided her decisions, each word carefully chosen yet spilling with emotion, because this was more than a story, it was a confession, a release, and a bridge between their lives, and Lucas listened with quiet intensity, absorbing each detail, nodding, asking occasional clarifying questions, never interrupting, because he understood that this was Emily's truth, her voice finally breaking free after years of silence, and as she spoke of hope, of heartbreak, of dreams deferred, she could see reflections of her own struggles in Lucas's eyes, the same yearning, the same sense of unfinished stories, and when she reached the part about the choices that had shaped the family he had grown up in, Lucas paused, taking a deep breath, his gaze steady, filled with understanding and empathy, and Emily felt an unexpected relief, because the fear of judgment that had haunted her for so long evaporated in the warmth of his acceptance, and as the conversation unfolded, memories mingled with emotions, laughter interspersed with tears, revealing not only the history of the family but the depth of love and resilience that had endured through absence and time, and Lucas shared how reading the letters had shifted something inside him, how he had begun to see the adults in his life not as infallible, but as human, flawed, yet capable of profound care and sacrifice. And Emily felt a profound connection, a sense that the gap between them, years and distance wide, was beginning to close, that honesty and vulnerability had created a new space for trust and understanding, and as the hours passed, their talk moved from past to present, exploring emotions long suppressed, hopes long deferred, and the unspoken bonds that still tethered them together, the conversation flowing naturally, intensely, sometimes breaking into silence where the weight of truth demanded contemplation, yet never once losing the emotional intimacy that had built between them in such a short time, and when they finally paused, exhaustion mingled with relief, Emily felt a lightness she had not known for years, a sense that the story she had carried alone was now shared, witnessed, acknowledged, and Lucas, looking at her with quiet gratitude, expressed how much it meant to finally hear the story directly, to feel the context behind the letters that had spoken so much to him in the absence of answers, and in that moment, a bridge was built between past regrets and present understanding, between love held quietly and love finally recognized, and as the day drew to a close, both of them sat in companionable silence, sipping tea, watching shadows shift across the room, realizing that revelation had transformed the ordinary visit into something profound, that what had started as a simple family gathering had evolved into a turning point, not only in understanding their family history but in understanding themselves, their hearts, and the emotional truths that shape every life, and Emily knew, as she glanced at Lucas, that the quiet release of the story had not only brought him clarity but had allowed her to reclaim a piece of herself, a freedom that comes only when long-held truths are finally spoken aloud, and Lucas, sensing the unspoken shifts within Emily, felt a tenderness for her that went beyond familial affection, a recognition of the depth of her emotions, the courage it took to speak honestly, and the way her vulnerability had allowed him to see the woman behind the letters, complex, resilient, human, and as night fell, they both understood that nothing would ever be the same, that the revelation had opened doors to understanding, connection, and perhaps even the quiet beginnings of healing hearts that had waited silently for years, and with that understanding, the house settled into a soft calm, carrying the echoes of words long held back, leaving them both aware that the ordinary had transformed into the extraordinary, that truth shared in love and empathy had the power to change not just a visit, but the way lives intertwined across time and distance. As the last of the afternoon light spilled through the windows, Emily and Lucas sat together in the living room, the house unusually quiet after the emotional storm of the morning, and a sense of calm settled over them, though it carried the weight of everything that had been revealed, because what had started as a casual visit had grown into an encounter that reshaped their understanding of family, love, and the passage of time, and Emily felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that sharing the story had lifted a burden she had carried alone for years, yet also exposed her heart in ways she hadn't allowed herself before, and Lucas, sensing the shift, leaned back in his chair, watching her closely, absorbing the subtle changes in her expression, the softness in her eyes now that the walls she had built around her past had begun to crumble. And he realized that the woman before him was not only his aunt but a deeply human person who had loved and lost, sacrificed and endured, and in that realization, a quiet admiration grew, a connection deeper than the years of absence, a bridge built from truth and vulnerability, and as they spoke gently about what the letters had revealed, about choices, regrets, and the unexpected turns of life, they laughed softly at memories, sighed at the weight of untold stories, and shared small silences that spoke more than words could, because in those pauses, they felt the unspoken bond of understanding forming, the emotional intimacy that comes only from witnessing another person's truth without judgment, and Emily reflected on how life had taught her to protect herself, to live with quiet compromise, yet this moment reminded her that honesty could be liberating, that revealing the past didn't have to fracture relationships but could instead create deeper connection, and Lucas, processing all he had learned, expressed gratitude not only for the answers but for the way Emily had trusted him with them, the courage it had taken to speak, the willingness to allow someone into the private corners of her heart, and Emily, touched by his words, realized that the visit had accomplished more than either of them could have anticipated. It had transformed old longing into understanding, uncertainty into clarity, and silence into shared history, and as evening deepened, they walked together to the porch, the cool air brushing against them, carrying a sense of closure and quiet hope, because the revelation had not ended with regret but had opened a door to reconciliation and appreciation for the lives they had led, the choices they had made, and the love that had always existed, even if hidden beneath years of distance and silence. And Lucas spoke softly about how reading the letters and hearing her story had changed the way he saw his own life, how it had given him a perspective on family, forgiveness, and the complexity of human emotions, and Emily listened, feeling pride and tenderness, knowing that her truth had allowed him to understand himself better, and in that shared understanding, a mutual respect and affection grew, not the naive adoration of youth, but a mature recognition of the depth of human feeling, the power of honesty, and the resilience of hearts that endure. And when they finally returned indoors, the house seemed lighter, filled with an unspoken warmth, because what had begun as a simple visit had culminated in revelation, connection, and emotional reconciliation, leaving both of them aware that the ordinary could transform into extraordinary when hearts were open. And as Lucas prepared to leave the next morning, their goodbye was gentle but meaningful, not rushed, marked by smiles, lingering glances, and the knowledge that distance no longer mattered, that the bond forged in truth and vulnerability would remain. And Emily watched his car disappear down the street, a mixture of melancholy and quiet joy filling her chest, realizing that sometimes life brings people back not to repeat the past but to reveal it, to heal it, and to give space for understanding to grow. And in that realization, she felt a renewed sense of hope for herself, for her family, and for the quiet possibility of love and connection that had always existed, waiting patiently for the courage to speak, for the willingness to listen, and for the grace to accept what life offers. And as the house settled into its evening calm, Emily knew that the ordinary visit had become a turning point, that truth spoken in honesty could transform hearts, and that sometimes the simplest encounters carry the most profound revelations, leaving people forever changed, connected, and quietly, beautifully healed.